Well, in the chat this morning, Catherine, Perry, and others have mentioned how much we miss being together. And I would echo that comment as well, that we just miss the gathering. We miss the being together. But we are in separate homes this morning, gathered together around Jesus Christ, our Savior, and around God's Word. Last week we began a sermon series through the book of Genesis. The big story is what we're calling it. It's a series of vignettes, stories through the book of Genesis that help connect us with this great big story that we're a part of, that God has invited us into. And this morning, Jacob is going to bring us a reading from Genesis chapter 9.
Genesis chapter 9, verse 8 to 17. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, and the wild animals, all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring the clouds over the earth, and a rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me, you, and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. So God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on earth.
Well, as I said, this year we've started this new sermon series, The Big Story. It's 10 sermons, 10 stories out of the book of Genesis. It's 10 familiar stories that we've heard many times, but my hope is through the sermon series that we're going to bring perhaps a different perspective. It's a little bit different of a look at each of these stories, perhaps a different approach to the text. And rather than treating these stories each as individual nuggets, individual stories that are separate and apart from each other, I would like to look at these stories as threads. Threads that are interwoven together into a great big cord that connects one big story right from the beginning, right to present day. One great big story. The Old Testament and the New Testament are not just storybooks with some weird stories in them. They're not just rule books with the rules scrambled or somehow put out of order. The Bible is God's story. It's a story about how God created. He created a world, and God is working to restore that world, a world that's been torn apart by sin and damaged by sin. God is working towards our own restoration. He's working towards our redemption, and he's inviting us to join him in that story. Now, in addition to seeing these stories as connected and all part of this great big story, I think it helps as we look at each of these stories to ask a question. What is it that we're learning about God in this story? I think that's a particularly helpful question to ask as we look at each one of these stories. How does it contribute to the picture that we have about the character and the nature of God? How does it add to what we've learned about God in other parts of the Bible? This is really important when talking about the story of Noah and the ark. It's a curious story, you have to admit, when you actually start getting into the details of the story of Noah and the ark. I really struggle sometimes wondering about why is this story in particular so popular amongst kids' Sunday school curriculums. You can't find a curriculum that works through the Old Testament that doesn't spend at least 1 or 2 weeks on the story of Noah and the ark. Why are there so many kids' coloring pages about the destruction of all life on earth? Why are there so many kids' songs about this story? It's kind of a dark story. If you do the math and you work through the genealogies, you get this picture of Lamech and Methuselah, Noah's dad, and his granddad beating against the side of this ark, unable to get in, drowning with all the rest of the people. And I bet you haven't seen a coloring page about that. We need to understand this story. And so I'd ask you to consider this. Imagine this. Imagine you're working through some of your mom's old papers and you find a story written by your mom about her mom, your grandma. And you read that story. You're going to reread that story. You're going to absorb the details and get right inside of it. You're probably going to share that story with other family members. Maybe scan it and send it out on an email, or maybe pop off a few TikToks about it. If your mom's still alive, you're going to check with her and get more details about the story. You might share this story with your kids, or share it with your friends, people that know your mom or knew your grandma. That story is going to be a window into the life of your mom and the life of your grandmother. It's going to tell you a little bit about who they are and what their values were, what was important to them. And since you came from them, that story, their story, is really part of your story. It might tell you a little bit about yourself, your motivations, and your values. So it would be weird, don't you think, if you set about confirming the historical details of this story that your mom wrote about your grandma, confirming the facts, collecting evidence, obsessing over tiny details in the story, evidence that would prove beyond the shadow of a doubt the intimate details of the story. Particularly if your mom's alive, and particularly if your mom happens to not be a pathological liar, it's a strange place to put the focus. It's a strange place to put all the attention and all the time and all the energy into confirming the historicity of the story that your mom wrote about your grandma, don't you think? But that's kind of what we end up doing with the story of Noah and the ark. We tell the story of Noah, the one person that God said that he could work with. The story begins in Genesis chapter 6. Our story writer tells us that sin had become so prevalent, it had become so widespread that every inclination of the thoughts of humans was evil all the time. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. But Noah somehow found favor in God's eyes, we read. Noah was somehow someone that God could work with, that God could partner with. This is one of the things that I would like you to notice during our sermon series, that God is always looking for partners. He's always looking for people with whom he can work with, people that he can work on. This is going to be a theme that's going to continue through our series. God tells Noah that he wants him to build an ark, and to build it out of gopher wood, and to collect 2 of all the animals and put them in the ark, and then he's going to send a flood that is going to destroy all life on earth. And typically our first response is to start checking the facts. Oh, wood? Oh, really? What kind of wood? Gopher wood? Okay, well, what's gopher wood? Oh, okay, yeah. And how big? How big's the boat? And exactly what would the boat look like? And well, would it float? Would it actually be seaworthy? And would all the animals fit? And what evidence do we have about this historically happening? And can somebody go find the ark? And, like, don't you see? We start chasing the details, collecting all the evidence. We're no longer even asking this question. What does this story tell us about God? What are we learning about the character and the nature of God? That should be the question that we're focusing on. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't have trouble believing in a flood. A God that creates the world by speaking it is going to have no trouble having animals show up on time and get in a boat with a guy. I don't get hung up on those details about what would the animals eat? How could you have enough food for all those animals? God fed 5,000 people out of a small kid's lunch. I don't think he's going to have trouble feeding animals in an ark. I don't have trouble believing the details of this story. There are some significant details in the story that I do think deserve some attention. There are details that I think are important for us to understand. Now, the more astute of you would notice that I've skipped over the Nephilim, haven't I? The sons of God and the daughters of men having children, heroes of old and men of renown. It happens early in Genesis chapter 6. Okay, well, what's all that about? I don't know. There's at least half a dozen good theories on all of them, and none of the theories are entirely satisfactory. It's almost as if that isn't the point of the story. It's like your mom writing about your grandma's favorite tree, and then you go out and get a doctorate degree and then start talking about growth rings and seed propagation. Like, pump the brakes, man. Let's just keep the focus where it belongs. There's a couple of things that I think are important for us to note while we're talking about this story and about the people that God chooses to work with. So the Nephilim are mentioned here in chapter 6 as though they are a problem. So I take that to be the truth. And God has got exactly two things to say about the Nephilim. As soon as they're mentioned in the story, God immediately says that human lives are now going to be limited to 120 years. And then for those of you that are familiar with the story, that's exactly what starts to happen. Human lives start getting shorter and shorter and shorter as the story goes on. And within a few chapters, we're talking about human lives that are more like what we would experience today. They're no longer 700 or 800 years old. And then secondly, God sees somehow in this story that evil is widespread, far more widespread than perhaps we can even imagine. It's like it's in the ground in ways that we can't fully understand. It's like sin is taking over creation. It's getting into the animals, it's into the water, it's into the ground. It's somehow corrupting everything about creation in ways that I just don't understand. If you read the beginning of chapter 6, you get the impression that something serious is happening here and something's going to have to be done. One other thing that I think it's important to understand is that the world sounds like it operates differently before the flood than now. There are lots of theories about that, but consider that when the flood happens, the water comes both from above and below in a way that isn't normal, in a way that doesn't seem to be true of today. It's just like the way the waters were described in Genesis chapter 1. There's water above and water below, that the sky is somehow pictured as a space between the two waters, water above and water below. And of course, people lived these really long lives before the flood. And then after the flood, just like God has said, the lives get shorter and shorter. This is one of the reasons why I don't subscribe to a young earth creation history, and that's something that we are not going to get into today in the sermon. It operates on the assumption that we can measure things today, we can count things today, and then we can work backwards to figure out how long ago things happened in the Bible. I'm just not sure it's that simple. I'm not sure everything was functioning and clicking now the way it was back then. I think some things in creation have fundamentally changed since the beginning. I think there are things that make it difficult for us to make descriptive, declarative, logical statements about events that have happened a long, long time ago. And perhaps we can talk about that during our sermon discussion time this morning. The point is that the creation story that we have in Genesis, this flood story that occurs in Genesis chapters 6 to 9, what do we learn about God, the God that made the world? About a God that wants to be in relationship with us, about a God who appears to be trying to put back together the pieces of this broken world. Well, the flood account that we have in Genesis is not the only flood story that we have. In fact, it's not even the oldest flood story that we have. It seems like every ancient culture across time has always had a flood story. And why is that? Well, I think it's because it really did happen. Every ancient culture has this vestigial memory that's kind of baked into their understanding of the world. It's a memory of a time when a flood happened. It's a story that seems to be passed down through ancient cultures. And the question is, what does the biblical account of the flood tell us about the character and the nature of God? What are we learning here in the story of Noah? It's surely not how to build a big boat that will hold all the animals. Perhaps it would be instructive to share another one of those stories as a contrast. So I want to talk for just a couple of minutes about one of the oldest pieces of literature that we have in existence. It's a story that's written in ancient Akkadian about 4,000 years ago. It's a Mesopotamian epic poem about our hero Gilgamesh. Now, it's a long story, so let me just give you the gist of it. Gilgamesh is on an epic journey throughout the known world, and he and his friends encounter each of the different Mesopotamian gods. And every time they meet these gods, the story follows some variation of basically one single plot line. He meets the god, he gets to know them and what they're all about and what they're trying to do. And every time the god gets angry, the god lashes out, either at Gilgamesh and his friends or at just all of humanity in general. And then Gilgamesh has got to somehow avoid the wrath of the gods or outsmart them in some way by his own clever designs. And so, for example, at one point in the story, we meet this new character. His name is Utnapishtim. And this friend of Gilgamesh overhears Ea retelling the plans of the great gods who are about to send a flood that will kill all of humanity. So Utnapishtim decides he's going to build a raft. And so he builds this raft 6 stories tall, and he puts all the animals in it. And he does so and thus foils the plans of the great gods. Now, the point here is not to determine if this story is true, or to determine did this story come first or did the biblical story come first. The point here is to just reflect for a minute. What does this story, the epic poem of Gilgamesh, what does that tell us about the people that wrote it and about how they saw the world and what they thought God was like? In Gilgamesh's story, the gods are multiple, malevolent, chaotic, semi-powerful beings who are best kept at arm's length. They are gods that are too dangerous to spend time with. They are gods that cannot be trusted. And we will ultimately either have to avoid their wrath or outsmart them in order for us to achieve our ultimate purpose. The point is, this is not our story. That's not our God. The one true God is revealed in this story that we read in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. So let's use that same logic and let's look at the story of Noah and see what is it we can learn about God. What does the flood account tell us about God's character and God's nature? And what does it tell us about people and their place in the world? Well, we first see in Genesis chapter 6 that God is a God who's grieved by sin, deeply grieved, but for reasons that we can't fully understand. God allows people to choose. God allows people to choose their own way. God never forces anybody to be righteous or to be good. God does not smite individual people the minute they stray from God's perfect designs. That's just not the way God works. That people have choices. But God graciously is hemming in the destruction. He's containing the destructive impact of sin, preserving and maintaining and protecting. God conserves and God protects. And God intends to save and preserve the goodness of his creation and not destroy it. God loves his creation and he loves the people that are a part of it, and sin grieves him deeply. The flood stands as a witness to the destructive power of sin. And in order to keep everything from being destroyed by sin, God saves a family that trust him and a sampling of all that he's created and saves that from destruction. The flood is a destructive moment. There's no doubt about it. But it also stands as a recreative moment. There are echoes in the text, something that we're going to see again and again as we work our way through Genesis. Turn to Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, and take a look at what's said there. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, we read that God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. He remembered. Now, this is not the same, the opposite, rather, of forget. It's not that God just kind of like, shoot, I left the water on. Or like, oh, I forgot Noah and all his animals in the ark. But instead, it's God remembered. God remained faithful. That God remained covenant keeping. That God cares. That God did not abandon creation. God does not abandon humanity. And then at the end of verse 1, we read this interesting phrase that God sent a wind over the waters. Now, what does that sound like? Now, it helps to know a little bit of Hebrew, that the word for wind, a Hebrew word ruach, is also the word for spirit and also the word for breath. It's the same word. And so God sent his ruach over the waters, his spirit. It sounds like an echo of Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, when the spirit hovered over the waters. It's like God is returning to the beginning. God is restarting creation. And then it stops raining. And so then, preserved again, we have this space between the water above and the water below. And as the water recedes, the dry ground appears and plant life begins on earth again. Then Noah releases a raven and he introduces birds into the air again. He releases a dove, another bird, which eventually doesn't return. Then the ark is opened and animals return to the earth. And then finally Noah and his family, humans, are introduced to the earth again. At the beginning of chapter 9, God reissues this initial command that he gave to Adam and Eve to be fruitful, to be abundant, to fill the earth, to subdue it, to maintain it. It's the 6 days of creation reenacted again, reacted out over the surface of the earth, that God is creating again. He's renewing again. He's starting all over. At the climax of this recreation moment, we have the words that Jacob read to us this morning. The God who saves, the God who restores, the God who recreates, the God who remembers his creation, he also creates a covenant. Now, this is the first of a series of covenants that God is going to create with humankind. But it's the first one. And we're going to look at this type of process over the next few weeks. Now, this, in the ancient Near East, would have been recognized as a suzerain vassal treaty. It's a treaty between a great power and the lesser powers, like a great king and his subjects would make a covenant like this. They would come together and make an agreement. And in this covenant agreement, God says, I'm never going to destroy the earth like this again. And covenants come with signs. Now, the sign, it's kind of like a receipt. It's proof of purchase. It's proof of the relationship that you had. And so each party of these covenants was responsible for, particularly the vassal, was responsible for keeping the sign of the covenant. They needed to keep that sign of the covenant in order to prove the covenant's existence. And so if you made a covenant with a great power and this document was then delivered to you as a sign of the covenant, you needed to keep the document. You needed to keep the proof that you were in relationship with this great power. But here we've got this beautiful picture. God keeps and he secures the sign of this covenant. It's a sign that can't be lost. It's a sign that's never going to get misplaced somehow in a moment of need. Every rainbow then is a symbol of this covenant. It's proof that God is going to keep his word. It's a reminder to humans and to God alike that God will not deal with sin in this way again. In fact, there's this clever little Easter egg, like a little hidden sign, a little chocolate bar up on the bookshelf that keeps a sign of the covenant in our presence. A rainbow in Hebrew, it's just bow, the word for bow. There is no Hebrew word for rainbow. And so if you think of a bow, like a bow and arrow, what way is the bow pointed? When you look out at a rain shower that's passed and the sunlight is refracting through the water droplets, you see this bow on the ground. It's a bow and arrow, and the bow is pointed not down but up. It's pointed with the business end pointing up. It's kind of like in the movies when you've got, the hero of the movie has to then surrender a firearm. And so instead of pointing the gun at somebody, in the movies they always do some cool thing where they flip the gun around and hold it by the grip or whatever the case may be. I don't know. The point is the gun's pointed away now. The gun is no longer a danger to you because now it's flipped up. My hand's off the trigger. I'm handing over this gun. The sign of the covenant symbolically is this bow turned away. It's a bow that demonstrates that God's never going to destroy creation again. But it also says a bunch of other things too. It's power surrendered. It's that the wrath of God is not arbitrarily and chaotically going to be cast out upon humans anymore. That's not our story. That's not our God. That God reserves his wrath. It's pointed back. It's pointed away. Our God is a God who restores. Our God is a God who recreates. Our God is a God who gives second chances. A God who remembers his creation. A God who still loves his creation. This God that we worship, this story that we belong to, is the story of a God who has a plan for sin, an ultimate plan for sin that is coming to something. And we're going to talk about that next week.